He alienated his cast, dictated scripts, and got a co-star fired to enforce his own rules. Yet to millions, he was the beloved face of a wholesome family sitcom. How exactly did Kirk Cameron become the most toxic teen star of the 90s? And why did the studio system actively protect his behavior? The previous video documented the brutal mechanics behind Julie McCullough's termination. Her contract was canceled just days before a historic wedding episode, entirely due to a fully legal, previously vetted photograph. But the network's midnight scramble to erase her character was not merely an isolated corporate panic. It was the opening shot. That single firing signaled the official beginning of a highly toxic era on the Growing Pains set, driven entirely by the radical transformation of its central star. In the 1980s, the television industry operated on a ruthless arithmetic. A wholesome public image generated advertising revenue. Network executives routinely utilized strict morality clauses to terminate actors who threatened this sanitized illusion. Yet, when Growing Pains premiered in 1985, this unbending rule was selectively suspended. Kirk Cameron, playing the charmingly rebellious Mike Seaver, quickly became the undisputed centerpiece of the network's long-term financial strategy. The ultimate goal for the ABC network was syndication, reaching 100 episodes to unlock decades of rerun profits. Because Cameron held the financial fate of the network in his hands, standard professional boundaries quickly eroded. The corporate structure prioritized the star over the ensemble, establishing a dangerous precedent where raw profitability completely eclipsed basic workplace protocols. On-screen, Kirk Cameron was the quintessential American teenager. He possessed a disarming smile, effortless comedic timing, and an easy, natural charisma that translated flawlessly through the camera lens. He was the undisputed anchor of a multi-million-dollar franchise, his face plastered across the covers of teen magazines like Tiger Beat and 16, and pinned to bedroom walls worldwide. The public saw a mildly rebellious, charmingly flawed youth navigating the standard trials of suburban adolescence. But behind the scenes, a profound and volatile psychological shift was taking root. The intense, unrelenting pressure of child stardom frequently creates an internal vacuum. For years, Kirk's identity was meticulously manufactured and managed by network executives, publicists, and scriptwriters. Every public appearance was choreographed, every interview vetted. He was a highly valuable commodity living inside a heavily guarded corporate bubble. The weight of carrying a network hit on adolescent shoulders is an unnatural burden, isolating the individual from the grounding realities of normal teenage life. He desperately needed an anchor outside of the superficial, high-stakes Hollywood ecosystem. At the age of 17, the trajectory of his life abruptly altered. He experienced a profound religious awakening, adopting a strict, fundamentalist interpretation of Christianity. His spiritual evolution immediately triggered a radical, absolute restructuring of his entire worldview. The belief system he embraced demanded a rigid adherence to a specific moral code, leaving no room for nuance or the inherent complexities of human behavior. From that moment forward, his internal compass shifted violently. What he feared most was no longer a drop in Nielsen ratings, a negative review from television critics, or the eventual fading of his celebrity status. His ultimate terror became spiritual contamination. He began to view the entertainment industry, the very environment that had elevated him to global fame and provided his immense wealth, as a den of inherent corruption and moral decay. The scripts, the jokes, the daily interactions on the studio lot were suddenly filtered through a lens of absolute purity. While his faith provided him with much-needed personal stability, his uncompromising, aggressive self-righteousness ultimately fractured the workplace. He transformed practically overnight from a collaborative, energetic cast member into an inflexible moral judge. The physical environment of the Growing Pains set immediately mirrored this internal fracture. Sitcom production relies heavily on the delicate alchemy of ensemble chemistry. This chemistry is forged during long, grueling hours of Monday table reads, meticulous stage blocking, and the high adrenaline pressure of Friday tape nights in front of a live studio audience. Initially, the cast operated as a tight-knit surrogate family, navigating the pressures of network television together, but as Kirk's ideology rapidly solidified, he began constructing impenetrable physical and psychological barriers. He stopped participating in the communal lunches that were a staple of cast bonding. He withdrew entirely to his dressing room whenever the camera stopped rolling, creating an isolated sanctuary to shield himself from the perceived impurity of his colleagues. The casual banter, the shared inside jokes, and the professional camaraderie that define a healthy, functioning television set evaporated. They were replaced by a tense, suffocating atmosphere where everyone felt they were walking on eggshells. Veteran actors, individuals who had spent decades navigating the complexities of the entertainment industry, suddenly found themselves alienated by a teenager who now viewed their standard professional behavior with open, undisguised disdain. Kirk did not just separate himself physically, he actively projected a heavy aura of judgment. And then Julie McCullough appeared on the studio lot. She was precisely the type of person who could make Kirk Cameron lose control because she represented everything his newly adopted ideology condemned. Yet her presence was entirely mandated by the network executives he answered to. On stage, Julie portrayed Julie Costello, the family's bright, engaging nanny who eventually captures Mike Seaver's heart. She was a genuinely gifted comedic actress, consistently hitting her marks, delivering her lines with a natural rhythm, and bringing a warmth to the screen that audiences immediately and overwhelmingly responded to. Her introduction to the show provided a massive boost in viewership, injecting fresh energy into the narrative. But behind the scenes, Julie's reality was far removed from the pristine, sanitized world of the Seaver household. She desperately needed the financial and professional stability of a recurring network television role. She had spent years navigating the grueling, unforgiving, and often predatory landscape of Los Angeles casting offices. What she feared most was having her hard-earned professional momentum, her one real shot at lasting security, derailed by the industry's notorious hypocrisy and double standards. Her vulnerability lay in a pragmatic career decision she had made years prior. In 1986, 3 years before securing her life-changing role on Growing Pains, Julie had posed for a pictorial in Playboy magazine. In the specific context of the 1980s entertainment industry, this was a calculated, widely accepted, and remarkably common career strategy for aspiring models and actresses attempting to break through the noise of Hollywood. It was utilized as a stepping stone to gain visibility, secure high-level representation, and land television auditions. It was an entirely legal endeavor, professionally executed, and most importantly, it was never hidden. When she signed her lucrative contract with ABC, her background was thoroughly vetted. The casting directors, the producers, and the highest-level network executives were fully aware of her portfolio. To the corporate machine, Her past was utterly irrelevant. She was simply a highly viable asset capable of boosting key viewership demographics. They hired her based exclusively on her comedic talent and her undeniable on-screen chemist. Awry with their lead actor, they did not choose trouble. The rigid mechanics of television scripting forced them into a collision course. As the on-screen relationship between Mike Seaver and Julie Costello blossomed, the ratings surged dramatically. The writing staff, recognizing a highly lucrative narrative arc that resonated perfectly with their target demographic, leaned heavily into the romance. A massive wedding storyline was meticulously developed, positioned by network marketing to be the marquee television event of the broadcast season. This creative direction meant significantly more screen time together, increasingly intimate scenes, and a heightened, inescapable promotional focus on the couple. From that moment on, the central question looming over the production was no longer whether the two actors could simply coexist in a professional capacity, but rather how long the fundamental volatile incompatibility of their off-screen realities could be contained before the entire structure collapsed. The very element that was drawing their characters closer together in the script was the exact mechanism that made Julie a primary target. For Kirk, simulating romance, delivering affectionate dialogue, and sharing physical intimacy with a woman whose past involved adult modeling became an intolerable, agonizing compromise of his newfound religious convictions. The absolute professional requirement to act alongside her collided violently with his overwhelming fear of spiritual contamination. The weekly table reads grew increasingly strained and agonizing to witness. Rehearsals that required even the slightest physical proximity or romantic dialogue devolved into silent battlegrounds. Kirk began to openly express his deep discomfort, effectively drawing an uncrossable line in the sand. He was no longer just isolating himself in his dressing room. He was actively resisting and subverting the creative direction of a multi-million-dollar production based entirely on his PE or banal, uncompromising moral judgments regarding his co-star. The door to a functional, collaborative working relationship was permanently slammed shut. They could not go back to simply being two actors, hitting their marks and reciting lines. The friction became palpable to everyone on the soundstage. The system, heavily reliant on the smooth execution of its weekly schedule, started to keenly notice the disruption. The scary thing in the television industry is never the rumor itself, nor is it the personal grievance of a single actor. The truly terrifying element is the machinery that dictates who has the power to turn a subjective grievance into an undeniable structural truth. In the late 1980s, the ABC television network was a colossal corporate apparatus governed by a strict hierarchy of executives, legal teams, and public relations strategists. These individuals did not operate on artistic impulse or moral philosophy. They operated on the cold, unforgiving metrics of viewership demographics and advertising revenue. They held the ultimate authority over every aspect of production. They controlled the exclusive contracts that bound the actors. They dictated the public relations narratives fed to the press, and they possessed the unilateral power to terminate any employee who threatened the financial stability of their prime-time schedule. They did not need to silence dissenting voices through public confrontation. They simply needed to leverage their institutional weight to make the production team too terrified to speak. When Kirk Cameron's intense discomfort regarding Julie McCullough reached a boiling point, the crisis was elevated from the soundstage to the corporate boardrooms. The situation was no longer a matter of on-set friction. It was a high-stakes economic liability. Cameron, emboldened by his status as the undisputed draw of the series, effectively issued an ultimatum. He expressed his absolute refusal to proceed with the highly anticipated, heavily marketed storyline that culminated in Mike Seaver marrying Julie Costello. To the network executives, this presented a catastrophic logistical nightmare. The entire broadcast season had been structured around this specific narrative arc. Promotional campaigns were already locked, advertising slots were sold at premium rates based on projected viewership for the wedding episode, and the writing staff had spent months meticulously laying the groundwork for the event. Yet when faced with the demands of a 17-year-old star, the network's response revealed the dark, deeply pragmatic reality of the Hollywood studio system. The executives initiated a brutal, calculated risk assessment. On one side of the ledger was Julie McCullough, a talented, highly popular actress who had demonstrably boosted the show's ratings, but whose presence was fundamentally replaceable in the grand machinery of a sitcom. Her past modeling career, while entirely legal and previously accepted by the network, now provided a convenient, socially acceptable pretext for her removal. On the other side of the ledger was Kirk Cameron, the golden goose, the irreplaceable face of a franchise that was rapidly approaching the monumental financial milestone of syndication. The mathematics of the situation were ruthlessly simple. The network was not defending a moral high ground. They were protecting an asset worth hundreds of millions of dollars in future syndication revenue. They recognized that the actors' fundamentalist ideology was actively dismantling a professional workplace, yet they chose to accommodate the disruption rather than risk losing their primary source of leverage with advertisers. The execution of this corporate decision was swift, clinical, and devoid of basic professional empathy. Behind closed doors, without consulting the primary creative team who had built the narrative architecture of the series, the network executives mandated a complete emergency overhaul of the storyline. The wedding script, which had been carefully honed and revised over weeks of collaborative effort, was abruptly scrapped entirely. The writing staff was forced to construct a hasty, logically fractured narrative to explain the sudden, jarring dissolution of the central romance. And then the final blow was delivered. Julie McCullough, the actress who had been promised a massive career breakthrough, received the notification that her contract was being immediately terminated. This termination occurred mere days before the production was scheduled to shoot the pivotal wedding episode. There was no transition, no graceful exit written for her character, and no public acknowledgement of the true reasons behind her dismissal. It was a surgical extraction designed to appease a teenager and neutralize a perceived threat to the show's financial stability. If you think this is simply a story of a young woman being forced out of a job by a difficult co-star, then you are fundamentally misreading the power dynamics at play. From this specific moment forward, the narrative changes entirely. The events are no longer reactive. They are systemic. The abrupt firing of Julie McCullough serves as the critical midpoint of this tragedy. It forces a complete reevaluation of the antagonist. Initially, the audience is led to believe that the primary destructive force on the set of Growing Pains was Kirk Cameron's extreme religious zealotry. The truth, however, is far more insidious. The true villain of the story is the corporate machinery that empowered him. Far from being victims held hostage by a demanding star, the ABC network functioned as active, willing accomplices. They weaponized their institutional authority to execute his demands, proving that they were perfectly willing to sacrifice the livelihood and reputation of an innocent employee to secure their profit margins. This was a silent agreement to survive, a corporate endorsement of unchecked abuse. And that single, calculated decisive triggered a chain reaction of consequences that neither the network nor the actors could possibly stop. The capitulation of the network established a dangerous, irreversible precedent on the soundstage. By validating Cameron's ultimatum regarding his co-star, the executives inadvertently handed him the keys to the entire production. He realized that his status as the show's primary asset granted him immunity from standard professional protocols, and he rapidly expanded his sphere of influence. Initially, the production team might have assumed that the removal of Julie McCullough would restore peace to the set. Instead, it merely served as the opening salvo in a much broader, far more destructive campaign of creative control. The escalation was methodical and suffocating. It shifted from personnel demands to a regime of strict, uncompromising censorship over the written word. The standard production schedule of a multi-camera television sitcom is a high-pressure, meticulously timed engine. It relies heavily on a collaborative process where writers pitch jokes, actors test dialogue during Monday table reads, and the narrative is constantly refined based on the organic rhythm of the cast. Cameron systematically dismantled this collaborative ecosystem. He began arriving at table reads not as an actor prepared to work, but as an inquisitor armed with a highlighter, ready to dissect the scripts for any perceived moral infractions. What began as minor suggestions to soften a punchline quickly escalated into hard, non-negotiable warnings. He demanded the immediate removal of any dialogue he deemed inappropriate, which, given his increasingly fundamentalist perspective, encompassed a vast array of standard comedic tropes. The restrictions placed on the writing staff became absurdly granular and creatively paralyzing. Cameron instituted a blanket ban on any scenes requiring physical intimacy. Mild innuendo, a staple of family sitcom humor designed to appeal to the adult demagogue. Graphic watching alongside their children was strictly forbidden. He refused to utter specific words, rejected storylines that involved mild rebellion or secular themes, and demanded that his character be rewritten to reflect his own rigid moral superiority. This was no longer a collaborative environment. It was a dictatorship masquerading as a workplace. The writers found themselves trapped in an impossible position. They were tasked with producing a hit television comedy, but they were forced to navigate a labyrinth of arbitrary, religiously motivated rules dictated by a teenager who possessed no formal training in screenwriting or narrative structure. Every script became a battlefield. Initially, the creators and the senior writing staff attempted to push back against this encroaching tyranny. Showrunners Dan Gunselman, Steve Marshall, and Neil Marlins were seasoned television veterans. They understood the mechanics of character development and the necessity of conflict in storytelling. They recognized that Cameron's demands were not just frustrating. They were actively stripping the series of its core humor and relatable human dynamics. When they attempted to hold the line and defend the integrity of their scripts, politely reminding the young actor of his contractual obligations to perform the material as written, the situation escalated to its most destructive phase. The pressure was no longer just about a tool or a contract. It was about the fundamental right to dictate reality. Cameron, fully aware of his untouchable status, simply bypassed the creative team entirely. He recognized that the showrunners, despite their titles, were ultimately employees of the network, just as he was. When a joke or a storyline was not removed to his exact specifications, he weaponized his direct access to the highest echelons of power. He would leave the soundstage, bypass the production offices, and place direct phone calls to the senior executives at ABC. He utilized the show is massive Nielsen ratings, not just as a defense, but as a blunt instrument of terror against his own colleagues. He essentially told the network leadership that if the writers did not bend to his specific moral dictates, he would refuse to rehearse, refuse to shoot, and effectively bring a multi-million-dollar production to a grinding halt. The executives, paralyzed by the sheer financial terror of losing the star that anchored their Tuesday night lineup, inevitably sided with the actor. They repeatedly undermined their own production team, contacting the showrunners and ordering them to implement Cameron's requested changes, regardless of how detrimental those changes were to the quality of the episode. This was a profound betrayal of the creative process. It was a stark reminder that in the Hollywood hierarchy, raw popularity consistently eclipses artistic integrity and professional experience. The message delivered to the creators was unmistakable. Their decades of expertise, their careful character arcs, and their dedication to the craft of television writing were entirely subservient to the whims of a 17-year-old boy. The environment became untenable. The writers were being forced to systematically destroy their own creation, translating religious fanaticism into palatable, sanitized comedy for a mainstream audience that remained completely oblivious to the war being waged behind the scenes. And then a critical breaking point occurred, one that made the creators definitively understand that from now on, they no longer had the right to choose how they told their story. To walk away from a top 10 television show in the late 1980s was not merely a career transition. It was an act of profound professional rebellion. In the television industry, creating a property that reaches the highly coveted syndication threshold is the equivalent of striking oil. Dan Gunselman, Steve Marshall, and Neil Marlines had drilled that well. They had spent years establishing the VE, Oyce of the Seaver family, meticulously calibrating the specific comedic rhythms that made the show a massive commercial success. To walk away from that machinery just as it was reaching its peak profitability was a testament to the absolute toxicity of the environment. In Hollywood, you do not willingly abandon a hit of that magnitude unless the daily reality has become fundamentally unlivable. Their departure was not a standard contract dispute or a mutual parting of ways. It was an evacuation. They chose to leave immense financial residuals on the table and abandon their own creative legacy because they could no longer endure the humiliation of having their work aggressively dismantled by a teenager. Their exit was the ultimate indictment of the ABC network's management. It proved that the corporate executives were perfectly willing to let the architects of their success walk out the door, so long as the highly marketable face of the franchise remained contractually bound to the screen. The vacuum created by the departure of the original showrunners was immediately filled by a new regime of compliant management. The network did not seek visionaries to replace the departing creators. They sought managers who understood that their primary directive was the absolute appeasement of Kirk Cameron. The writing room transformed from a collaborative space of comedic invention into a defensive bunker. Scripts were no longer written to be funny, engaging, or authentic to the teenage experience. They were written solely to survive the gauntlet of Cameron's Monday morning table read. The new writers explicitly understood the unwritten parameters of their employment. They proactively sanitized the dialogue, stripping away any edge, any mild rebellion, and any genuine human conflict that might trigger the star's religious objections. The character of Mike Seaver, who had been introduced to the American public as a charming, girl-crazy underachiever, was systematically hollowed out. The natural friction of adolescence that made him relatable to millions was replaced by a sterile, preachy persona. He was no longer a teenager navigating the world. He was a mouthpiece for a highly specific, uncompromising moral ideology. The audience, sitting in their living rooms, may not have understood the complex corporate politics dictating the scripts, but they subconsciously registered the tonal shift. The canned laughter on the soundtrack remained loud, but the actual soul of the narrative had completely evaporated. While the writers bore the brunt of the creative suffocation, the psychological toll on the remaining cast members was equally devastating. The true depth of this dysfunction was vividly reflected in the room's veterans. Alan Thicke, who played the patriarch Jason Seaver, was not merely an actor for hire. He was a seasoned Hollywood professional, a highly successful television producer, and a prolific writer in his own right. He possessed a deep, intricate understanding of the mechanics of television production. He knew exactly how a set was supposed to function, how a cast was supposed to collaborate, and how a script was supposed to be executed. Yet he found himself trapped in a dynamic where his decades of industry experience were entirely subordinate to the religious dictates of a youth. The indignity of this power inversion was profound. Thicke, along with Joanna Kearns, who played the mother Maggie Seaver, was forced to stand by and watch a teenager actively destroy the professional environment they all relied upon for their livelihoods. They were contractually obligated to perform scenes they knew were creatively bankrupt, delivering dialogue that had been aggressively neutered to appease their co-star. The adults in the room were rendered entirely powerless by a corporate structure that prioritized the demands of a teen idol over fundamental workplace respect. They swallowed their professional pride week after week, projecting an image of warm parental guidance on screen while navigating a minefield of tension. Off camera, the alienation was not just professional, it was deeply personal. Perhaps the most tragic casualty of Cameron's ideological shift was his relationship with Tracy Gold, who played his on-screen sister, Carol Seaver. During the early years of the production, before the massive influx of wealth and the subsequent religious awakening, Cameron and Gold had forged a genuine, close-knit friendship. They were teenagers navigating the bizarre, high-pressure reality of child stardom together. They shared inside jokes, supported one another through the grueling production schedule, and provided a sense of grounded reality for each other amidst the artificiality of Hollywood. But as Cameron's fundamentalism took root, that bond was aggressively severed. His new worldview categorized the world into strict binaries of pure and impure, and he began to view his longtime friend through a lens of harsh judgment. He withdrew his affection, his conversation, and his camaraderie entirely. For Gold, the loss was profound and unilateral. She was suddenly frozen out by the person she had considered a confidant, left to navigate the intense pressures of the industry without her primary source of on-set support. The physical proximity required by their roles made the emotional distance agonizing. They were forced to stand inches apart, pretending to be siblings bound by unconditional love while existing in a state of absolute, chilling estrangement the moment the director called cut. This is the true cost of unchecked power in the workplace. It is not just the explosive arguments or the high-profile firings. It is the silent, pervasive atmosphere of fear and isolation that settles over a production. The Growing Pains set became a masterclass in professional endurance. The day-to-day reality of filming the final seasons was described by many involved as suffocating. The standard banter between takes, the spontaneous moments of levity that typically sustain a crew through 14-hour workdays completely vanished. The actors retreated to their respective dressing rooms the moment they were not required under the studio lights. The sound stage, which had once been a vibrant, collaborative environment, felt like a morgue. The crew moved quietly, actively avoiding anything that might spark a confrontation. The silence on that set was not peaceful. It was purely defensive. It was the silence of dozens of professionals collectively deciding to suppress their own personalities, their own creative instincts, and their own basic need for workplace camaraderie, simply to survive the employment contract. No one pressures you more than your own fear, and the entire production was operating under the constant looming threat of the star's disapproval. The price the cast paid was not just enduring a difficult colleague, it was losing the right to exist authentically within their own profession. As the series dragged into its final seasons, the consequences of this creative and emotional bankruptcy finally began to reflect in the one metric the network executives actually cared about. The Nielsen ratings began a steady, undeniable decline. The audience was visibly losing interest in the sanitized, moralistic direction of the show. The core demographic that had originally tuned in to watch the rebellious antics of Mike Seaver was entirely alienated by his sudden transformation into a rigid, humorless figure. Cameron's strict refusal to engage in standard teenage storylines, explicitly refusing to film typical dating scenes, or reject any dialogue that hinted at youthful indiscretion, left the writers with a massive narrative void. The show had completely lost its central engine of conflict and charm. Absolute panic finally set into the corporate boardrooms of ABC. Recognizing that their primary asset had effectively aged out of his appeal and actively driven away his own fan base, network executives initiated a desperate, incredibly transparent maneuver to save their sinking property. They ordered the immediate introduction of a new character, a charismatic, troubled teenager specifically designed to fill the exact archetype that Cameron now refused to play. They cast a young, relatively unknown actor named Leonardo DiCaprio in the role of Luke Brower, a homeless student taken in by the Seaver family. The introduction of DiCaprio was a glaring public admission of failure by the network. It was an explicit acknowledgement that the show's highly paid star could no longer carry the narrative weight of the series. DiCaprio was brought in to inject the exact brand of raw, rebellious teenage energy that had originally made Growing Pains a massive hit, the very energy that Cameron's religious ideology had systematically eradicated from the production. The dynamic on set during this final season became surreal. The veteran cast members, already exhausted by years of walking on eggshells, were now tasked with integrating a new, highly talented, rapidly rising actor into a deeply fractured environment. Cameron, meanwhile, found himself creatively sidelined on his own show. His character was relegated to delivering dry moral lectures, while the new addition absorbed the compelling storylines and the audience's attention. It was a bizarre, uncomfortable transition of power, played out under the bright lights of a sitcom stage. The machinery of the industry was clumsily attempting to correct its own mistake, trying to artificially graft a new heart into a body that had already rejected its original programming. Despite the desperate injection of new talent, the damage to the series was irreversible. The structural integrity of the show had been compromised far too deeply, and the audience had definitively moved on. In the spring of 1992, after 7 seasons and over 160 episodes, ABC quietly canceled Growing Pains. The end of a long-running television series is typically marked by profound emotion, a celebration of a shared journey, and a deep sense of familial loss among the cast and crew. But the wrap party for this production was entirely different. Instead of a celebration, the final wrap party dissolved into an exhausted exhalation of relief. The moment the director called cut on the final scene of the finale, the heavy, suffocating facade that the cast had been forced to maintain for years instantly dropped. The artificial family dissolved the second the cameras powered down. The severing of ties was absolute and immediate. There were no lingering farewells, no promises to stay in touch, and no tearful embraces. The vast majority of the main cast members, individuals who had spent 7 years of their lives standing shoulder to shoulder in the trenches of network television, walked off the studio lot and completely cut off all communication with Kirk Cameron. The silence that had dominated the set during the final years simply extended into their personal lives. They did not invite him to their subsequent life events. They did not reach out for reunions, and they actively avoided discussing him in the press for years. The trauma of the experience had bonded the rest of the cast together, but it had entirely excised the person who was meant to be their center. The supreme cruelty of the situation was finalized by the fact that the public, watching the emotional series finale from their living rooms, remained completely unaware of the wreckage. The audience cried for the end of the Seaver family, believing they were saying goodbye to a group of people who genuinely loved each other off-screen. They were sold a beautifully packaged lie right up until the final frame. The hoax was executed perfectly. The network secured their astronomical syndication millions. The public retained their wholesome illusion, and the actors were left to quietly heal from the psychological scars of their employment. This was the true cost of doing business in a system that values the image of morality over the practice of human decency. When the studio lights powered down for the final time in the spring of 1992, the true machinery of the television empire shifted into its most critical phase. The production of new episodes had ceased, but the financial lifeblood of the series was only just beginning to pump at maximum capacity. The ABC network and the production studios had successfully dragged their fractured, deeply unhappy cast across the syndication finish line. In the television industry, syndication is the ultimate end game. It is the process where a studio leases the rights to broadcast past seasons of a show to independent stations and international markets. The revenue generated from these reruns is astronomical, often dwarfing the profits made during the original primetime broadcast. For this incredibly lucrative revenue stream to remain viable, the public's perception of the product must remain absolutely pristine. The illusion of the wholesome, deeply connected Seaver family had to be preserved at all costs, even as the actors themselves were sprinting in opposite directions the moment their contracts expired. To protect this asset, the corporate apparatus initiated a massive, silent campaign of reputation management. The public relations teams worked aggressively to ensure that the narrative surrounding the end of the series focused entirely on the natural conclusion of a beloved family story, rather than the toxic, unworkable environment that had actually forced its demise. The silence of the cast members was not merely a product of their exhaustion, it was heavily enforced by the structural realities of their profession. Standard entertainment contracts of that era contained rigorous, non-disparagement clauses. To speak openly to the press about the religious extremism, the censorship, or the ruthless firing of Julie McCullough would have invited immediate, devastating litigation from the studio. Furthermore, for veteran actors like Alan Thicke and younger stars like Tracy Gold, their future livelihoods depended on remaining employable within that very same studio system. Hollywood is an insular, fiercely communicative town. Earning a reputation as a whistleblower or a difficult talent who airs dirty laundry to the media is a rapid way to end a career. They were forced to absorb their trauma in complete silence. They had to watch themselves in daily syndicated reruns, smiling and embracing a colleague who had actively made their professional lives a living nightmare, unable to tell the public the truth about the images flickering on their screens. The cast was forced into silence by strict non-disparagement clauses. They had to watch themselves in daily syndicated reruns, smiling and embracing a colleague who had dismantled their workplace, unable to tell the public the truth. While the network successfully secured its syndication fortune, the immediate aftermath for Kirk Cameron's career provided a stark, brutal lesson in the realities of the broader entertainment industry. Upon the cancellation of the sitcom, he found himself suddenly detached from the protective corporate bubble of ABC. He was 21 years old, immensely wealthy, and carrying the highest level of global name recognition. In a standard Hollywood trajectory, this is the exact moment an actor transitions into major feature films, leveraging their television audience into box office returns. However, the exact opposite occurred. As he attempted to pivot into mainstream cinema and adult roles, he hit an immediate, impenetrable wall. The power he wielded with absolute impunity on the sitcom stage simply did not exist outside of that specific network contract. Hollywood casting directors, producers, and film executives are deeply interconnected. The rumors and whispered warnings regarding his behavior had circulated throughout the industry for years. The story, as of his script demands, his refusal to perform standard scenes, his role in firing co-stars, and his overarching attitude of moral superiority had preceded him into every casting office in Los Angeles. A major motion picture is a massive financial risk, often involving tens of millions of dollars and incredibly tight shooting schedules. Film directors require actors who are collaborative, flexible, and willing to serve the vision of the narrative. No major studio was willing to risk a massive budget on an actor with a documented history of holding productions hostage over personal, ideological disputes. There was no formal blacklist drawn up in a boardroom. It was a silent collective consensus among the people who controlled the capital and the casting. The doors to mainstream Hollywood quietly but firmly locked him out. The profound irony of his situation was unavoidable. The exact behavior that he believed was protecting his spiritual purity was the precise mechanism that destroyed his professional viability in the industry he had dominated. He had spent years isolating himself from his colleagues, building walls to keep out what he perceived as the corrupting influence of the mainstream entertainment world. Now that same world simply refused to let him back in. The isolation he had artificially created on the soundstage became his permanent, inescapable professional reality. He was a globally recognized superstar who was functionally unemployable in the very industry that had created him. The leverage of teenage popularity is incredibly potent, but it is also brutally brief. Once the core demographic aged out and the sitcom's safety net was removed, he was judged solely on his reputation as a working professional. And that reputation was completely toxic. This professional exile forced a massive, permanent pivot in his life trajectory. Unable to secure roles that aligned with his stringent personal restrictions within the traditional studio system, he was compelled to effectively abandon mainstream Hollywood entirely. He began to forge a new path in a completely parallel, highly insulated industry, independent, faith-based cinema. This was not a smooth or glamorous transition. It was a descent from the pinnacle of global pop culture into a niche market that operated on vastly smaller budgets and catered to a highly specific, predetermined audience. He traded the massive reach of network television for the narrow corridors of evangelical media production. The psychological shift required to make this transition is immense. To go from being the most recognizable teenager on the planet, with the power to dictate terms to massive corporate executives, to suddenly producing low-budget films outside of the established industry structure, requires a deep, fundamental redefinition of success. Yet even within this new, highly specific ecosystem, the underlying patterns of his behavior began to replicate themselves. He did not simply become an actor in religious films. He sought to become the primary moral authority within that space. He eventually partnered with evangelical figures to create ministries and media companies dedicated to aggressively promoting a highly rigid, literal interpretation of theology. He utilized his fading celebrity status as a platform to launch sweeping judgments against the broader culture, the LGBTQ plus community, and the very entertainment industry that had provided his initial wealth. The boy who had terrorized a television writer's room over mild sitcom jokes morphed into an adult who attempted to dictate moral parameters for society at large. The scale of the platform changed, but the fundamental need for absolute control and the unyielding belief in his own moral superiority remained entirely intact. The timeline is irrefutable. The 17-year-old who leveraged his power to terminate a co-star directly evolved into the 50-year-old who defied public health mandates during a global crisis. The Mackinac SM remained identical, personal conviction placed above the safety and livelihood of the community. ABC network executives trained him to believe his demands were absolute. By capitulating to his ultimatums for syndication profits, they validated a toxic narcissism. The deception started on a Hollywood soundstage, but the price continues to be paid in the real world. In our next investigation, we step away from 1980s television and enter the heavily guarded gates of the Golden Age studio system. We will open the files on a production machine that dictated not just what its stars could say on camera, but who they could marry and how they lived every second of their private lives. The mechanism of manipulation is identical, but the stakes are elevated from the loss of a role to the complete erasure of personal autonomy. Subscribe to avoid missing the next episode.